Boxy. Boxy. We're live. Hi, I'm Larry Harnisch, and this is Boxy. Boxy is the Los Angeles County District Attorney's files in the Black Dahlia case. And this is the monthly Ask Me Anything on George Hodel and Steve Hodel for May 2025. I started doing the Ask Me Anythings a couple of years ago now, I think. And I was originally just doing the Black Dahlia, but I got so many George Hodel and Steve Hodel questions that I didn't want to clunk them up. I didn't want to clunk up that session, so I made it a separate session. So Black Dahlia session is June 3rd. The next one is June 3rd. And then the next George Hodel live chat will be June 17th. And, oh, does it? Okay, thank you. I'll have to go in and fix that. Yeah, I can't fix it. I can't fix it now, but what happens is I copy over from week to week, from month to month. So I'll have to go in and fix that. Thank you. Anyway, who am I? Larry Harnisch. 27 years at the Los Angeles Times. No, 34 years in the news business, 34 years in journalism, 27 at the Los Angeles Times. My thing is history and fact checking. That's what I do. I've been working on a Black Dahlia project for a long time. People have the notion that Larry Harnisch, somehow has writer's block. No, it just takes time to do a competent job, or what I consider to be a competent job. So that's the story on that. So this is the George Hodel and Steve Hodel. Again, it isn't ask me anything. It's not a tell me anything. This is more of a statement than I don't want to hear that. Don't waste my time with that. Questions are always welcome. Skepticism is okay. Being quarrelsome is not okay. So I'll just leave it at that. A couple of bits of Dahlia news before we get going into the Q&A. First of all, there is a new Black Dahlia book out. It is a forthcoming book. It won't be published until October. I got an advanced look at it on NetGalley. And if you don't know what NetGalley is, you can sign up for that, and you can get advanced reading copies of they're review copies of books. They're not necessarily thoroughly edited. You might find typos and that kind of thing. But this was an advanced review copy. It's called Sisters in Death by Eli Frankel. And I will talk more about this in the Dahlia session. Frankel tries to tie together the murders of Elizabeth Short in Los Angeles and a woman named Lila Welsh in Kansas City in 1941. And he tries to, force them into being just the same. And they were both committed by this Carl Balsiger. Okay, I don't want to waste a lot of time on that here. The interesting thing about it is he doesn't mention George Hodel or Steve Hodel at all. Not one time. He doesn't address Steve Hodel's claims. He doesn't address Black Dahlia Avenger, which is an interesting approach. Just to assume that doesn't exist. I think Steve Hodel is going to be maybe a little butthurt over that, but that's really all I want to say on this episode, is that it doesn't mention George Hodel or Steve Hodel at all. Yeah, I'm going to get to that. The other thing is there was a TV show done on Discovery Expedition Files, and they asked me if I wanted to do an interview. I got approached by them in October. Do you want to do an interview? Would you be interested in doing an interview? And I gave my standard response. No, I don't give interviews on the Black Dahlia case. That is why I do this. I do an Ask Me Anything once a month, because I am so fed up with the poor quality of true crime TV shows and podcasts and articles. I just don't want to be anymore. I just don't want to be part of them anymore. I just don't want to deal with them. And so what the Expedition Files came up with was a George Hodel, Steve Hodel piece. And they basically recycled something that had been in the South Pasadena paper a while back about this letter that somebody found, and maybe it implicates George Hodel, and supposedly was written by an informant. And, no, it's, I hate to even waste time on it. It's just, clutching at straws. And of course, Steve tries to make a big deal about it, but nah, it just isn't worth my time to even, I think I'm pretty sure I did a blog entry about it. I think. The thing about the letter that's interesting is it's not complete. They don't show the entire letter and they don't quote the entire letter. I actually attempted to transcribe it based on what was published in the it was the South Pasadena newspaper website. So again, you're dealing with a very small town paper, and that sort of thing. Okay, did I? Yeah. So I just don't want to waste a lot of time on that. But there was yet another TV show, and all it accomplished was, it convinced me even more. I don't want to do interviews on the Black Dahlia. One of the reasons is that these folks will use me for historical context, because Steve Hodel can't do any of that. What was LA like in the 40s? He'll say, well, it was a real life LA Confidential, yada yada yada, and he can't give you anything nuanced because that's not how his parallel world works. And so they use me for that, and then they cut to, retired homicide detective says dead dad is serial killer, which is what happened here. So I actually got pitched a couple more TV shows that I turned down. One was from Japan. It was actually a pretty reputable channel in Japan. And I, was like, well, maybe. And then I thought, no. And then there was one from a French, and the solicitations of these interviews are high. I'm an independent filmmaker, and I have won such and such an award, and I want to do something on the Black Dahlia, and it'll be a link to 2 credits on IMDb that might be kind of a while ago or something like that. And it's like, nah, I just don't think so. So I don't do interviews anymore. I do this, and that is fine for me. So anyway, that's kind of really the only thing that's new. Steve's gotten to the point where he's recycling his old blog posts, where he'll say, "Oh yeah, here's this blog post from years ago that says, here are all the conveniently dead people who say I solved the Black Dahlia case," and it's like, no, they didn't say that. They're all invented. And while I'm just ranting and raving here, every once in a while I'll go on Twitter. I know, X, Twitter, and there's a guy out there on Twitter who he has just gone off the deep end on George Hodel. He has found all kinds of hidden messages in the postcards and whatnot that were sent to the newspapers, not by George Hodel, just by random people. And, it was like George Hodel was involved with the murder of Alan Turing. And it's like, ow. People really go off the deep end on the George Hodel stuff. If you want to see some loony stuff, go out on Twitter. If you still have Twitter, go out on Twitter and do a search for George Hodel. You'll find some really, really wild stuff. And that's all I'll say about that. I am on Reddit occasionally. I will see what people say on Reddit about George Hodel, and there's usually some pushback. But I want to talk about something that shows up on Reddit fairly often, and that is Root of Evil. Okay, and I'm sure I talked about Root of Evil before, and when it came out, I talked about it a lot. Root of Evil was a podcast that was done to accompany the TBS miniseries I Am the Night I think it was 2019, with Christopher Pine and India Isley, directed by Patty Jenkins and written by Sam Sheridan. It was, notice this, inspired by the life of Fauna Hodel. Okay, so how did that really work? Well, if you look at the life of Fauna Hodel, it's a completely different story until 2003. and this is kind of the genesis of this whole branch of the story. Fauna Hodel had an interesting life story on her own, and then Black Dahlia Avenger came out in 2003, and Fauna Hodel, for whatever reason, just incorporated all of Steve's claims in her life story. Again, totally fictitious, but that's what she did. And so she, interestingly enough, and one of them's here, Fauna Hodel enlisted a couple of people independently of me to go out and fact check Steve Hodel's claims. And they came back to her and said, nah, it's all junk. But she went with it anyway. Anyway, I Am the Night was based on Fauna Hodel, inspired by the life of Fauna Hodel, inspired. And the companion podcast with that was Root of Evil. And of course, Fauna Hodel by this point had died of cancer. And so the project was turned over to her daughters, Yvette and Rasha. And they were handed a script. Yvette and Rasha were handed a script by Zach Levitt. They were told exactly what to say. It was not spontaneous, oh, we remember this, we remember that. That was all scripted. And so it became very popular, but it's a work of fiction. It comes from the mind of Zach Levitt based on Black Dahlia Avenger. Anyway, that's kind of my rant about Root of Evil and all that sort of thing. And let's see. All right. I think I've ranted enough. Let's go ahead to some questions here. I got something over on no, I'm in my house. Somebody wants to know where I am, and I'm in my house. Thank you. Okay, let's see. Oh, I said, is there any validity to the police informant letter mentioning GH? I did a blog post on that. Okay, somebody asked, why do you suppose Steve Hodel thinks it's acceptable to call his father a great and remarkable man when he allegedly killed 50 people in 50 years? It would be insane to call Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy, or Richard Ramirez a great man, but yet Steve doesn't have a problem calling a guy who allegedly chopped up a little girl, Suzanne Degnan, a great man. The more I think about it, the more it frustrates me. I wonder what the victim's family would think if they heard Steve say that. Well, you bring up a very interesting point. I have never had the opportunity to ask Steve Hodel that question, but I know someone who did. There was a guy who's a friend of mine. His name is Doug Laux, and he did a podcast. He spent years on a Black Dahlia podcast, and he interviewed me. He interviewed Steve Hodel. And at one point he asked him, Steve, how can you claim to love your dad when he did all these terrible things? How is that possible? And Steve said, oh yeah, I loved my father, blah, 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 and it's like, yeah, good question. I don't have an answer for that. But as I said, I know someone who did ask him that question, and it does strain credibility quite a bit. The only reaction I know of is that of the Short family, and they are, they think that Steve Hodel is just a fast buck artist who is making money off their grief. As far as they're concerned, they saw when this originally came out, one of Elizabeth Short's relatives and one of her sisters was in the grocery store, and they saw an article in People magazine about, the Dahlia and Steve Hodel's pictures. And, they contacted me and they said, are they crazy? Can't they see that's not her? And so they issued a statement through me saying, that is not Elizabeth Short. Those photographs are not Elizabeth Short. And I know I've talked about this before, but Steve will talk his way all around the photographs. He'll say, well, I saw these pictures. They made me think of, well, they didn't remind him of the Black Dahlia. They reminded him of this old TV movie with Lucy Arnaz. Okay, fine. and then he'll say, well, it doesn't matter if they're her or not. They just serve to get me interested in the story. But then he'll turn around and say, yeah, I think it's her. And, Steve every once in a while will say, well, yes, German facial recognition software says it's her. No, they're not her. Not her at all. But again, I don't know what all of the victims would say. I have no idea. I mean, in terms of Suzanne Degnan's family, I can't even imagine. They have been through enough. But, I do know what the reaction of the Shorts family, Elizabeth Shorts family, has been to Steve Hodel. And he's just another fast buck artist trying to make money off of their grief. Okay, let's see. Didn't Steve not? Yeah. The interesting thing about I Am the Night and Root of Evil is that I Am the Night, Sam Sheridan's script and other people script for that miniseries didn't credit him at all. I'm not sure he got $1 out of that TV show. I don't think he got any TV money out of that. So he was kind of miffed about that because they did use a lot of his material, his claims. Yeah, and I don't think he liked Root of Evil either. He did one TV show, and it was like Good Morning America or something like that. And they actually got a comment from the LAPD saying none of these theories have any merit at all. So that was about the only interesting thing to come out of it. But yeah, Steve did show up for that TV segment, and that's about it. Okay. Yeah, somebody asked me, would you be in my documentary? No, as I said, I don't do documentaries. I don't give interviews on the Black Dahlia case. It is not worth my patience to do it. I do these instead. But doing an interview on the Black Dahlia case, no, I do this instead. So thank you for the request, but no thanks. Let's see. What else have we got here? Was Jean Spangler the picture of the girl in George Hodel's photo book? No. Interesting question. Steve has to do a lot of fancy footwork to try to support the idea that his dad killed Jean Spangler. Because, of course, you must realize in the parallel world of Steve Hodel, his father committed every famous unsolved murder. His dad traveled the world committing famous unsolved murders, 50 murders in 50 years. There is, in reality, no connection between Jean Spangler and George Hodel. As a matter of fact, George Hodel, when Jean Spangler disappeared, and I forget the exact dates on this because I'm relying on my memory, George Hodel was arrested and Jean Spangler disappeared. It was like within a day of each other. And Steve will say, oh, well, Dad, bailed out of jail immediately. Well, we don't know that. Maybe he did, maybe not. But the point is, if, you've got a guy who's just been arrested, probably being watched by the police, and he's going to go disappear this actress. How does that make any sense? It just doesn't. And Steve's motive is, oh, well, she knew too much. Probably one of the main motives in the parallel reality of Steve world is somebody or other knew too much. They knew too much. They couldn't touch George Hodel because he knew too much. That kind of thing. So no. Is it Jean Spangler? No. Okay, what do we got over here? What was that show you were on a few years back where Bill Curtis interviewed you? Yeah, that was a fun show. I can't remember the name of it. That was a good while ago. I would say that had to be maybe 15 years ago. And that was really well done. That was probably one of the best shows that I was involved in. Bill Curtis was an old-time news guy. His wife was sort of the producer who pulled things together. But that show was really well researched, well produced. They spent a lot of money on it. They had, and that's the thing about these true crime shows. The average person sitting in front of their TV at home, you have no idea. You really don't. How much these production companies cut corners on doing a show. And that's one reason I quit doing them. Bill Curtis had 2 camera guys. And of course, this is Los Angeles. You know, you can hire camera guys and sound guys practically on the street corner. He came out from, he was based in Chicago. He came out with his 2 camera guys and a sound guy. I'm pretty sure it was just one sound guy, but he had a full crew with him. And it was really, as I said, it was very well researched. It was very well thought out. The shot locations were very good. He got me driving a Crown Vic, driving around Los Angeles. That was kind of amusing. But I would have to say, in the long term, that was really one of the better ones I was involved in. These days, as I said, you have the average person sitting at home. You have no idea how much these production companies are cutting corners. Very little research anymore. Almost done. The crew it's not a separate, oh yeah, Cold Case Files, right. It's a pickup camera guy here in LA. They don't bring out their own. And more important, no sound guy. The camera guy also does sound, which is a decision. But as I said, you know, it's very poorly researched. There was one where I went, they had me go out to, it was this place in the valley. It looked like an industrial park. And it was just this room. And they had me sit at a table and they hit me with some lights and did the interview. And, you know, it's just, they're just so low budget and so thrown together that it's like, I just don't want any part of them anymore. It's really not worth it. Okay. Let's see. Eugene, you had a question from last time that I didn't answer. And it was, did Steve's mother live to see the book published, and did she ever speak publicly about it? No, no. And I thought that she had died. Dorothy Hodel died in 1981, so she never saw Black Dahlia. She was about 20 plus years before publication of Black Dahlia Avenger. And I would point out that Steve is not shy about throwing his mom under the bus when it comes to the Black Dahlia case. He will tell you, for example, that his mother helped clean up after his dad killed Ruth Spalding, the secretary. It's like, no, that didn't happen. First of all, George Hodel didn't kill the secretary. She committed suicide. And second of all, there's no reason to think that Dorothy Hodel helped clean up. That's just fantasy. You can't imagine how much Steve makes up. None of that stuff is true. And he will write about it. And I see this on social media now. That Dorothy and George Hodel used to have 3-ways with Maddie Comfort. And it's like, where is that from? The only mention of, because I've got Boxy here, the only mention of Maddie Comfort in Boxy. Maddie Comfort appears in a couple of movies. She's a musician. She had kind of an interesting life. Frank Jimison, who was the district attorney's lieutenant, who was handling the investigation of the district attorney portion of the Dahlia case. He interviewed Dorothy Hodel, and he was trying to shock her to get some kind of response from her. And so he showed her a picture of George Hodel and Maddie Comfort nude. And, you know, Dorothy Hodel, I guess he thought she was going to react out of jealousy or whatever, and she didn't. She said, you know, that's George Hodel. And I'm not sure she even knew who Maddie Comfort was. But that's it. That is the extent of the Maddie Comfort. Everything else that Steve tells you, that's all imaginary. You really cannot imagine how much he's made up. Okay. And do you have any thoughts on that bug that recorded, supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia? Yes. Oh, thank you for asking. That's a good one. You see, the transcripts are all in here. And well, here's the thing. The transcripts, what happened was you had a guy sitting, I guess, in Hollywood Station or whatever, and he was listening and he was typing up what he heard. And so it's not necessarily verbatim. He will say, Hodel is listening to music, stuff like that. So it isn't exactly it's not exactly what was said in the room, but here's the thing about the bug. And just to back up, George Hodel was arrested on charges of sexually abusing his daughter Tamar. He was found not guilty by a jury predominantly of women, but he was put under surveillance by a combination of the LAPD and the district attorney's office. And they had him under surveillance for 5.5 weeks, and then they just gave up that there's nothing here. It's boring. It's dull. And if you read the transcripts, which are online, by the way, I posted them, they're dull. They are very dull. Steve Hodel kind of cherry picks them. And he will do things like, one of the technicians says, "Oh, I had trouble with one reel." And Steve will transform that into his dad saying, "I'm in trouble." No, no, just play straight. What happened is this guy said, "I'm having trouble with the equipment." It's not his dad saying, "I'm in trouble." Anyway, when you read the transcripts impartially, you bring a fresh eye to it, you will see what does George Hodel say? He says, "They're out to get me." Right at the very beginning, he says, "They're out to get me." And then he says, "Men from the telephone company were here." Okay. So what do you get? You've got an individual who's not dumb. Okay. He says, "They're out to get me." He says, "Men from the telephone company were here." So he knows something is up. And so when you get to, and it's only like the third page, it's like the third page of the transcripts. If you read that carefully, you can see he's looking for the microphone, because he says something like, "Must be around here somewhere." So they're looking for a microphone. "They're out to get me. Men from the quote telephone company were here," and he's looking for something. And so once he finds the microphone, which he's looking for, he starts shooting off his mouth about all kinds of stuff. He starts talking about the Black Dahlia case. And then later on, he'll say, "Well, if you're in law enforcement, you can get a good deal on clothing or furniture or stuff like that." He knows they're listening to him. I mean, the whole investigation was compromised. A lot of times he's got a radio going, or he's in the bathroom and the water's running, stuff like that. It does pick up one or two things, but again, it's really not all that helpful. Kind of his phone conversations. He spends a lot of time typing, a lot, and they will complain about how much typing George Hodel is doing. And I think one of my favorite comments is that the guys listening to it said, Hodel is listening to Chinese music. It's worse than the Mexican music. So, I mean, it's like, a smoking gun. It is not. So supposing I did kill the Dahlia, he knew they were listening. He was baiting the cops, and it's really no more complicated than that. Okay. So do I have any Instagram? No. Okay. Let's see. Oh, okay. Oh, and I should mention, I got schooled by a commenter. A guy left a comment on my YouTube channel, which I chose not to publish because it's my channel and I can publish it if I want to. The guy claimed to be a theoretical physicist and a writer, and he left me interesting comments like, "You are an idiot." He didn't like my reaction video. He said, "You keep interrupting." It's like, yeah, it's a reaction video. That's what it does. Then he wanted to school me on Caltech, and it's like, you know what? I live in Southern California. I live about 3 miles from Caltech. I go over there for lectures and stuff, so I'm familiar with the campus. So yeah, I'm up to speed on that. And then he wanted to get into the IQ test, and basically, Steve's claims about his dad's IQ test are just so inflated, it's ridiculous. He will say his dad had an IQ score of one point higher than Einstein. Well, no. Einstein never took an IQ test. Why would he? He was an adult. So that's it's just garbage. We do have George Hodel's actual IQ score, which is not, I think Steve says it was 181. I think it's in the 150s, which isn't bad, but it's online. George Hodel was part of the Lewis Terman study, and all of the results of those exams and questionnaires are online. You can download them. I downloaded them, and the individuals are identified by date of birth, where they live, male or female, what their score was, what are they doing in life, that sort of thing. But again, they were all on computer punch card, and so they were transferred to these. If you're familiar with that, the comma delineated files. So you have to be very patient to untangle them. But we have George Hodel's score, and as I said, it's really more in the 150s. But the bottom line on the IQ score is this: IQ, intelligence quotient. Okay, what does that mean? It's a ratio. It's a ratio of chronological age and intellectual age. However, you choose to establish intellectual age. It's a ratio. So IQ score of 100 is an 8-year-old kid who scores like an 8, who has the intellectual performs at the intellectual level of an 8-year-old. That's it. It's not hard. In my opinion, speaking as someone who tested really well on IQ exams, in my opinion, IQ tests, certainly when George Hodel was taking it, and even in the 50s when I was taking it, they are socially, racially biased toward white middle class and upper class kids, which, surprise, I was. So, all it proves is you know how to take a test. They're really not very useful, and certainly not like by the time you get somebody in their teenage years. If you want to know if a kid is smart, you just talk to them. And the same thing with an adult. I mean, I have friends in Mensa, so I'll be careful here. But the thing is, if you're an adult and you have a high IQ score, are they going to compare a 20-year-old functioning at the level of a 30-year-old? I don't know. Anyway, that's the whole thing on this guy who schooled me. Yes. How much is AI being currently used in the Betty Short ecosystem? I imagine it's frequent and terrible. Yes. The biggest abuses, and if you're not up to speed on it, the Chicago Sun-Times published a summer supplement. It was an advertorial. It didn't come from the editorial department. It's one of these special sections to sell ads. And it was ostensibly one page was, books for summer reading. Well, they had used AI to generate the list. And of course, most of the books don't exist. They were by known authors, but the books don't exist. So there's a big outcry over that. The thing about AI is you can, mostly videos, people are dumping, I can't even imagine. I don't know how to quantify them. Hundreds, thousands of Black Dahlia AI videos with an artificial voice, artificial narration, stock shots. It's just the worst of the worst. And I get alerts on these things, and there's no views. It's just, but YouTube is being flooded with junky AI videos. More than I think than anything else, it's the junky AI videos. Okay, let's see. Do you know if Steve is still writing another book about the case, or now that he has been thoroughly exposed, do you think he has changed his mind? My opinion is that, Steve is, my best take is this. Steve began Black Dahlia Avenger as a scam. He knew the photographs weren't Elizabeth Short. He decided to write this bogus book and got a lot of attention, got a lot of interviews, became a New York Times bestseller, and he kind of became hooked on the attention, the book readings, the audiences, all that kind of thing. And so I think he's kind of like an addict where he has to keep writing books. And I think the other element is that he knows his basic case is so shaky that he needs to keep finding new clues and new evidence to support his claims about his dad. He can never just say, well, I'm done with it. I've written it and that's it. He will be pushing this until, the last day. But it's, whether he's got another book in him, I don't know. I think he's up to Black Dahlia Avenger 4, and he's written a couple of books about George Hodel's early years in the 1920s and 1930s. And then he gets help. There's a guy named Luigi, or he calls himself Luigi. I'm blanking on Luigi's last name. I didn't think I would ever do that. Anyway, it's a guy named Luigi who works really hard to implicate George Hodel in this killing up in the Bay Area when George would have been a teenager. And it's like there's no basic groundwork of how would George Hodel get up to the Bay Area to do this killing. It's just, oh yeah, he did that. Luigi Warren, that's the guy's name. How could I ever forget? Anyway, I think that I think that Steve just needs the constant affirmation. As long as he is above the sod, I think he's going to need to do that. And he likes the attention. He likes the books reading. He likes to do the bookstore appearances and all that stuff. He likes to do that, I think. That's my best read. Okay, let's see. Let me go over to one of the submitted questions here. Okay. I'm wondering whether there were ever any contemporaneous references in the papers to George Hodel having been a suspect in the Black Dahlia case. Did it ever come up in the coverage of the incest trial, or did that only come out later after Steve Hodel's book came out in the DA's files, all of us known as Boxy, was made available for some inspection? Additionally, has your research turned up any newspaper references to Hodel while he was in the Philippines? Okay. This is what is important about the trial of George Hodel. And I've done other sessions on this before. Okay. This is very important. And again, one of Steve's techniques is to assume that people don't know courtroom procedure, rules of evidence, that kind of thing. And I will tell you now, having served on juries, what lawyers say is evidence. What lawyers say in a trial is not evidence. And the juries cannot consider that at all. The jurors can only consider what a witnesses say in response to a lawyer's question. And so what Steve likes to do is, there was a question by George Hodel's defense attorney. I want to say Neff. I'm relying on my memory here. But Tamar Hodel was on the witness stand, and George Hodel's attorney said, do you remember saying that George Hodel is a killer? He murdered the Black Dahlia. He's a blood fiend, something like that. He's going to kill all of us. He killed the Black Dahlia, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And Steve will say that. It's not evidence. You don't get to consider that because it's from an attorney. It's not evidence. What is the evidence? The evidence is Tamar's answer, which is no. I don't remember that. I never, So, yeah, that's the only time it really came up. And I want to point out a couple of other important things about the trial of George Hodel and Steve's claims. Steve, being a cop, and this is one of the things that really gets my goat about Steve, is he will say, oh yeah, well, when the detectives who were transporting Tamar to court told her that George was a suspect in the Black Dahlia case, and the average person, you don't see anything wrong with that. I do. Why do I see something wrong with that? Well, before I became a writer, I worked in the juvenile justice system for 6.5 years. And let me tell you right now, you are not going to have adult males transporting a female juvenile. No effing way. I guarantee you, Tamar Hodel was transported to court by matrons from, I think she was at El Retiro, or taken to El Retiro later on. No. That didn't happen. That's just imaginary. And again, if you had never worked in the legal system, if you didn't know that about the juvenile justice system, you wouldn't know that. You wouldn't know that. But that's the reality of how juveniles are treated in the justice system. You're not going to get adult males anywhere around underage girls, especially who are making allegations. No, you're going to have female officers the whole way. And, as I said, the average person is, that's going to go right over their head. They don't know that. But having worked in the and Steve knows that. Having worked in the juvenile justice system, there is absolutely no way that would have happened. That's not possible. The other question, has your research turned up any newspaper references to Hodel while he was in the Philippines? Not a lot. I mean, researching the life of George Hodel is a pain, okay? Which is why most people don't do it. They're content to let Steve run his mouth. There are some. We know from professional directories what his address was. We do know that. We know from customs things that are like on ancestry.com. We know when he came back to the U.S. and when he left and that sort of thing, because he would have to go through customs. So we kind of know that, but not a lot. The Philippine newspapers are not necessarily heavily represented, or at least I have. I get newspapers.com and Genealogy Bank, and I have not spent a lot of time going through the Philippine papers. The foreign newspapers, probably not. But there isn't a lot. When George Hodel moves to Hawaii, there are some articles about him, and Dr. Hodel does this, that, and the other thing. There are some articles about his time in Hawaii, but after that, not really. No. Okay. Let's see. Do we know who the German guy was George was talking to? Steve says he's Baron Haringa. I'm not sure I've ever bothered to look into that. There's only so many hours in the day and only one Larry Harnisch. To me, it's kind of a non-event. Let's see here. Okay, what do we got? Why didn't the newspapers dig into doctors like George Hodel? Were any known as suspects? That's a good question. That's a very good question. When the newspapers were doing all of the heavy-duty Black Dahlia reporting, they got a hold of a page of her address book. And there was a doctor on one page named A.E. Brix, B-R-I-X. They never talked to the guy. I don't know why, but they didn't. Several papers got his name. They just never talked to him. They threw a lot of reporters at the story, but I think it was more the kind of running after the news or that kind of thing there. I think there were other the newspapers were more consumed with like Red Manley. We've got to find the red-headed stranger, the mysterious red. That's who they were looking for. They were devoting all their time to that. They weren't looking at doctors at that point. It was the whole Red Manley thing and who is he and all that kind of stuff. That's what they really did until they found Red Manley. And that took a few days. And then the so-called address book was mailed to the papers. I think it was around the time of the inquest. If I remember correctly, it was about the time of the inquest, within a day or two. But that's really it. They were looking more at I think just to expound in the press coverage of the Black Dahlia case. I think that the police and the newspapers all kind of expected the murder was committed by some psycho young man who had come back from World War II and was totally messed up mentally and had lost his leg. Because there were some World War II veterans who came back, and these guys were so young. They were in their early 20s. I mean, if you're my age or younger, you think of the greatest generation are these old guys. And it's like, no, you look at photos of them and stuff like that. They're in their 20s. And there were certain incidents where these World War II veterans were just bonkers crazy. And of course, they were getting electroshock therapy. That's good for you, and stuff like that. So, I mean, um, so um, yeah, okay. Um, yeah, the Sun Times piece was horrendous. Do Steve's sons buy into his BS? I don't know. I have never talked to any of Steve's relatives, so I don't know. Let's see. Question: if George Hodel did not kill the Black Dahlia, Elizabeth Short, then that would put in doubt any and all other cases that Steve Hodel is linked to his father. So no, GH is not Zodiac. GH is not a murderer at all. Or could it be possible that GA murdered his secretary or some other woman? Fruit of the poison tree would pretty much mean that any and all cases linked to George Hodel by Steve Hodel should be questioned, if not ignored. Your thoughts? Okay, we know for sure. Um, we know for sure that George Hodel did not kill his secretary. She committed suicide, and no amount of fancy talk by Steve Hodel. And Steve will say bizarre things like he overdosed her. Well, no, she died of an overdose of barbiturates. I have her death certificate. I posted it online. Her death was investigated. It was a suicide, and that is that. Um, it's that simple. The Suzanne Degnan killing, this little girl who was killed in Chicago in January 1946. My biggest, in order for George Hodel to really do that, okay, he's going to have to, how is he going to find Suzanne Degnan? And the whole thing is, the whole Degnan Dahlia thing is that there's a street a couple of blocks from where Elizabeth Short's body was found. Elizabeth Short's body was found on Norton. And there's a street a couple blocks away named Degnan, okay? So there was this nut job who got the idea that the killings were linked and that Elizabeth Short's body was left on Norton as a pointer to Degnan. Well, Steve stole that idea. Steve has now made it his idea. And in the most recent statements, he will say that Elizabeth Short's body was left off Degnan or on Degnan. He's even gone so far as saying Norton and Degnan are the same street. I mean, he's desperate for this body to have been moved a couple of blocks. It's bizarre. If you really know anything about the Black Dahlia case, some of the stuff Steve says is just nuts. Anyway, but, for that to work, George Hodel would have to go through, first of all, he'd have to pick, well, I'm going to have to leave somebody's body, a victim, on Norton Avenue and point to Degnan, and I'm going to have to find somebody in Chicago named Degnan, and they have to have a little, it's like, no. And Steve got really involved on saying, oh, well, poor old William Hirons, he was, it was a wrongful conviction. It's like, I've read the original stories. I'm convinced William Hirons did it. But Steve's only interest in that is, it's like, well, I want to prove Hirons didn't do it because, of course, my dad did it. And Jean French, those murders are totally different. That's the other one that George Hodel, I would say that one is, Jean French was murdered a couple of weeks after Elizabeth Short, February 10th, 1947. Horrible death. I mean, it was nasty. She was pushed out of a car. I think she and the killer were struggling in the car, and then he pushed her out and then stomped on her and basically stomped her to death and maybe beat her with something like the handle of a socket wrench, something like that. And we have pictures of the crime scene with the heel of the guy who stomped her to death. And they could figure out, based on that heel print, the size shoe that the guy wore. Well, he had tiny feet. George Hodel did not have tiny feet. You won't hear that. Steve Hodel doesn't address any of that stuff. So I think those are the three. And I have been spending time on the autopsies, and I've gone through the autopsy of Elizabeth Short and Jean French. And when maybe to the lay person at the crime scene, maybe they look similar, but you get these ladies on the autopsy table, and it is night and day, totally different. Okay. What happened to all the Black Dahlia physical evidence? Did it disappear? Yeah, Steve likes to say that. And some of the police like to say that. Okay, what evidence is there? Let me turn that around. All the evidence that is missing, okay? Like what? Like what? Elizabeth Short, let me point out, Elizabeth Short was found naked, okay, in an open, in an open field, no clothing, no jewelry, no purse, nothing. That's it. Um, the only thing that they had that they knew was from the killer was this little envelope of things from her purse that the killer mailed to the newspapers. That's it. That's all they had. So it's like there really isn't a lot to be. A lot of Elizabeth Short's things that they didn't need, they returned to the family. Is the short answer there. Yeah, was the only reason they opened the investigation into Hodel because they wanted to get back at him? Well, George certainly thought so. George said, they're out to get me. A couple of men were transferred because of his trial. And let me point out, as I have before, the district attorney had just created a team to handle juvenile type offenses. And they had just successfully prosecuted a dad for molesting his daughter. He went to San Quentin. So it's not like, oh, we don't know what we're doing, help. No, they had just nailed a guy. And who was interested in news coverage of that trial? Tamar Hodel. Gosh, how about that? But that really did happen. So potentially, but again, they had him under surveillance for 5.5 weeks. There's nothing there, and they just said, lights out, we're done. It isn't like, George fled just ahead of the police, because he didn't. The reality is that after the trial, even though he was found not guilty, George Hodel couldn't get a job. And that's what all that typing is. He's typing madly on job applications and stuff like that. Nobody would hire him. He had to go all the way to Hawaii, not to get away from the cops, but to find a job. Nobody would hire him. And so that is the real story. And let me point out, the LAPD could certainly have extradited George Hodel from Hawaii. It was not a state, it was American territory. If they wanted, all they had to do was send a telex or whatever, a wire to the Honolulu Police Department and say, hey, pick up this guy. We'll be out to get him. And that's it. They didn't do that. They didn't want him. They were done. Did George Hodel really learn to do hemicorporectomy in medical school? And if so, that has been as rare as Steve claimed. No, the hemicorporectomy being taught in medical school is totally an invention of Steve Hodel. That didn't happen. No, in reality, absolutely not. More important, let's talk about George Hodel's surgical experience. Steve will tell you, well, my dad had 700 something hours of surgical training. Yeah. That's what you needed. That's what you needed to graduate from medical school. Everybody who graduated from medical school had that. Okay. That was the minimum. He never did postgraduate work in surgery. He did postgraduate work in venereal disease. That was his specialty. And to really hang out your shingle as a surgeon in any serious way, you would need postgraduate work. And let me point out, for the 100,000th time, George Hodel was not accredited by the American College of Surgeons, so no reputable hospital would have let him operate anyway. So no, hemicorporectomy didn't come along until many years later. I think it was written about as a theoretical thing. But of course, Steve will grasp any straw that will, bolster his crazy ideas. But no, the reality is no. Steve really hated the LA Noire video game because George Hodel is never mentioned once in the Dahlia cases featured. I don't know. I was a consultant on that game, and LA Noire was, it was done by these guys down in Australia. And they would write to me, hey, they would have all these questions. And then I wouldn't hear from them for like a year. I'd forget all about them. And then they would write to me again with all these questions. And they wanted me to take all these newspaper covers and send them down to Australia. It's like, okay, on your dime, fine, I'll FedEx all this stuff to Australia. Somebody on Reddit asked if Dr. So-and-so, there's a doctor and there's Dr. So-and-so, is that really Dr. Hodel? I have never played the game. People have talked to me about it. I even got a long interview in the New York Times about L.A. Noire. Actually, the guy did a very, very good interview, as it so happens. But I don't know. Steve gets butthurt very easily. Let me put it that way. Yeah, Steve said he's wired to seek the truth. Well, of course he's going to say that. I mean, from the very beginning, it's a joke. The whole genesis of it is his dad dies, and he and Tamar are on the phone reminiscing about the great man. Okay, this is the great man who molested her. They're reminiscing about what a great man he was. Really? A molestation victim is reminiscing about her great dad? Boy, that doesn't make sense. And, she says, well, he was a suspect in the Dahlia case, but he didn't do it. And so, Steve goes on this mission to exonerate his dad. And it's like, that had already been done. I mean, Steve did not need to go on a mission to exonerate dear old dad. Dear old dad had been cleared decades earlier. So it's just, it's more Steve Hodel nonsense. What's interesting, and I've been fact checking Steve Hodel for 22 years, is there is a lot more pushback now on Reddit than there used to be, and elsewhere on social media. So it is interesting that people will do that. Now, Wikipedia, Steve will go into the Wikipedia article on his dad, and he will do all kinds of major edits. I caught him doing that recently. I don't think it was a major edit, but he will go in and edit that, even though, and there's a warning, Steve Hodel, naughty, he still does it. Do I believe Tamar's accusations were truthful? No. And here's why not. Tamar was an incorrigible teenage girl, and her mom was at her wit's end with Tamar. Finally said, I can't handle you anymore. She was a pathological liar. So I'm going to send you down to live with your dad in Los Angeles. So that's what happened. And before she came down to Los Angeles, she told her older half brother, Duncan, I'm going to make up a story about dad molesting me. But it won't be true, but the cops won't know that, and I'll get him in trouble. And Duncan testified to that in the trial. So, that's kind of it. When you look at the arc of, okay, Instagram, you've got to go away here. Goodbye. I'm limited to 1 hour here, so adios. And now, yeah. Okay. When you look at the arc of Tamar's life, okay. It is lying and misrepresentation from the get-go. Her mother said so. Her grandmother said so. There was a whole parade of women who testified in the trial of George Hodel. They all said the same thing. We would not believe Tamar Hodel under oath. Her kids say that she was a liar and manipulator. At least the ones who aren't Fauna Hodel. I think Fauna won because there's two daughters named Fauna. I'm not really sure, but I mean, Tamar's track record for being reliable is very, very shady. I mean, remember, you're talking about a lady who handed her baby off to a washroom attendant. It's like, this is not somebody who's going to be a reliable witness or a reliable source. It's just not. So no, I don't believe that at all. And I think on that note, I think we'll close. Thanks everybody for showing up. I'll do this again in a month. Again, the Dahlia session will be June 3rd. And at that point, June 3rd, right? Yeah. And at that point, I will talk a lot more about Eli Frankel's Sisters in Death. I posted a review of it on my blog. And so I will talk about that. And then George Hodel next on, did I say the 17th? Yes. Okay. So it's been fun. Great to see everybody. And we'll do this again in a month. Take care. Say bye. Say goodbye, Boxy. Okay. All righty.